I guess, where are the people that added my list? Welcome Dongsun, and who I see down here, and also Dilpreet, who I don't see yet. Dilpreet. So hopefully Dilpreet will find his way here. So I found the number of people had made it through to the last part of the lab and getting something up and running on OKD, so that's great. And as I was telling everybody, the lab is formally due next Monday. Oh, there's Dilpreet. Okay, coming in. So can you hear us, Dilpreet? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So people that are weren't on my list before, so presumably starting, be sure that you go through the installing the tools and document, get your laptop set up to do all that, and create an account on GitLab, and then log in to OKD so you have an account there, and then do the rest of lab 1. And doing the first lab will be a good test of your tool setup, and people will often find lots of surprises with that. But working through it, asking questions and so on, then after a while it's not so bad. Okay, so any questions before I get started on anything quickly? Because we have more lecture material. We need to learn a little bit more about JSF and also beans. Okay, but those are independent topics. Okay, so no questions. So let's just pull up my desktop here and slideshow in a window so that I can sort of also see if people have questions in chat. Then that's fine and good. Okay, so what I'm mainly talking about today is beans. And unfortunately in Java, the word, because Java itself was named after coffee, and so coffee beans is a common meme that they will use, and they'll use that word in a lot of situations. So there exists a thing called Java beans, and that's not that hard. You get 90% there by following the convention on naming getters and setters, which is covered way back. Okay, and let's see, question in chat here somewhere. So lab 1, there's nothing that you have to submit, although in a way, getting the WordPress application, which you didn't write, but still getting it to run, that is a submission of a sort. Okay, so the lab is you have to do it, and so I can look and see everything that you did basically on a Normally, when we're face to face, what I will do to mark the labs is I will go around and visit everybody individually, physically, because we're all in one room. Now it's not so, not so much. Okay, so yeah, so when the WordPress app is running, then it's not in. So the WordPress application doesn't have anything to do with GitLab. GitLab just gives you your credentials so you can log in to OKD. Okay, the WordPress application is actually coming from Docker repository. Because I didn't write WordPress. Heaven forbid that I would do such a thing. I'm not even a fan of WordPress, but it is an impressive capability to be able to just do it for like 4 lines. Okay, and indeed, Abir, there's a lot of moving parts, the hope is that those will start to settle at a faster rate than I throw in new moving parts, so that you actually wind up feeling that you're making progress. Okay. Now, the JSF is a framework and is one of many ways of creating a user interface with a browser. And one of the things that it uses to move data around is what used to be called web beans, but is now called CDI beans. And that uses a bunch of capabilities that wind up being used in a number of different technologies. So it's useful to know about this. It's good in and of itself, and it's also good when you go to do other things with different technologies. Okay, so we're going to go through, what is a bean, some of the definitions, CDI in particular, and then deal with some JSF stuff that's also useful, like how do I deal with internationalization and what the heck is that anyway? Another simple application. And then in passing, they'll come up with a new concept that we have to get a handle on, which is scopes. And again, that's a general concept. It exists in across technologies, but I'll be focusing on the Java version of it, and a little bit more on value expressions towards the end. Okay, so let's see. Now okay, good. It's tricky where to put all the chat things. I don't quite have my desktop organized so that I can do everything at once. Okay, so the idea is that you got data, you got to store it somewhere. Okay, so what do? And it turns out that what do we do with data is a complicated question. You've seen databases already, and there's different kinds of databases, some relational, some not. There's in-memory databases, there's databases backed up with disk storage of some sort, and on and on and on. So then it turns out that when we're storing things, there is a question of, well, for how long? Short-term, long-term. The more questions we ask, the more solutions there are, the more complicated it gets. Okay, so this is one thing that is commonly used for storing stuff, where it might not be around for that long, so we don't want to go through the trouble of persisting into a database. Okay, so why can I use beans? Well, what is a bean? A bean is basically just a kind of Java class. Okay, so from classes I create objects, and if I follow the convention for getters and setters, in other words, I name them get, set, followed by a word which is a property name, then I've got a Java bean. And so that means I can store stuff in the bean, and I can, from the outside, I can call the setter to store it and a getter to fetch it back. As well, I need some way of creating an object, and the convention is that you have a constructor that takes no arguments. So from the name of the class, you know how to call a zero argument constructor, so that you can create objects. Okay. So this down below here, zero argument constructor follows property naming convention. That's about, well, I guess 90% of the significant part of the Java bean specification. There's a lot more for edge cases that we don't have to worry about. Okay. Now, so that's handy. From that, it turns out that an IDE can then use Java reflection, which you might have seen in your second Java class, to figure out what are the getters and setters, and therefore what properties are there. Okay. So it is important in concept that the property of a bean is determined by the getters and setters, not by the fields that are in the bean. Okay, so a getter and setter might or might not have a field underneath. Doesn't matter. The property names come from the getters and setters. Okay, and usually there's also fields behind the getters and setters, but doesn't have to be. Okay, so we saw that in the last example. There was a user bean object, and we said that its name should be user, and that was used to move data between two JSF pages. So as I said, a property is a significant concept. And what does it have? Okay, well, it has getters and setters. So the getter implies it has a name, but getters and setters also have return types and parameter types. So that says that a property has a particular type. Okay? And if it's a read-only property, I need a getter. If it's a write-only property, I need a setter. If it's read-write, I need both. So here's a little bit on the naming convention. So we've seen before that this business about capitalizing a field name if there is a field, and what I don't generally tell people before is that there's a special case if you have acronyms. So United Nations, UN is an acronym. And if I want to say UNspec, then the standard would recognize from the fact that I've got two capital letters together that it must be an acronym. And in that case, I don't decapitalize the U. Okay, so that's a special case that can confuse people, especially when they fall into it accidentally. So like say I had a first name field, and I didn't want to spell out first, so maybe I call it F name, where I just have first represented by an F. And so then I might wind up with two capital letters together in the getter and setter, and I would have fallen into the acronym special case by accident. Okay, so that's why I mentioned it, and you can forget about it until you fall into the problem and get a mysterious error message, and then that's what's going on. Okay, and there's a special case for Boolean just to make it more readable, is that you can use is instead of get. Okay, so that's properties, and 90% of this was covered in every single Java course that you've ever been in. Okay, now we saw last time value expressions. There's two kinds of them, of which I'm only going to be using one: £sign ones and $1 ones. Okay, and so these are commonly used in a number of instances, and we'll see more of them as we get more examples. The idea is that I'm instead of having static code that never changes in a web page, I want to have something that depends on data of some sort, or maybe something that's calculated. So the JSF components will generally have a value attribute where I can plug in a value, and the most common usage of this will be where it should be dynamic, in which case I use a bean property, and I mentioned last time that depending on the context, the system will automatically call the getter when it wants to read the value to render the component. And when it's processing the user response and wants to store it, it will call a setter to store it in the model after it's been through validation. Okay? And we will always use the £sign. And the £sign version says that whenever you need the value, deal with its most current value. So evaluate the expression and use whatever it gives you. With a $sign, which is older, it will only do it once when the page is processed. It's not dynamic. So you don't do it when the page is run. Okay, and as I say, the dollar sign is just for completeness in case you see it somewhere. I don't think I will use it at all this year, other than on this slide. So we need to know how the dollar sign works and evaluate it whenever I need it. Okay. Now, how often do I need the value? Well, that's sort of hard to say. It depends on the implementation. If the value is unchanging, then the logic doesn't matter if I read it 5 times. It'll get the same value 5 times. From a performance standpoint, sometimes you need to know. Okay, but we'll go a fair ways without worrying about how often the value is needed. Whenever it's needed, you evaluate the expression. Okay. Now, what do we store in a bean? Okay, well, we saw last time that we start with the JSF page, it's processed, and a Java model is created that has a Java object for each web component. So each JSF component in particular will usually correspond to a Java object. And that Java object, if it's say an input field, will store whatever was entered into the input text box. But it will have other things as well. So it's possible, if you want, to actually get a hold of that component object. And if you do that, then you're using a thing called a backing bean. Okay. So rather than just having the data that's stored, you're holding the whole component. And usually there's no reason to do that. But if you're going to use a backing bean, then you have to know a little bit more what's going on in JSF. So JSF has classes, which you will see UI output, UI input. And if for some reason you want to actually get a hold of those objects, then you can do that. And you have an attribute in the tag called binding. And that allows you to take the actual component and store it into a property. Okay. Way later, we will see an example of using that, but for the most part, that's not good style. You're dealing with a lot more complications than you have to. Okay, so this is a slide that I'm just saying so that you know what's there. Some IDEs, not ones that I'm using, will do this by default. That's probably a bad idea. Okay, so that's backing beans. Okay, so that's a little bit of fast stuff. Now, big topic. Okay, CDI beans. And so first thing is, what the heck is CDI? Well, it's an acronym. Java has lots of acronyms. And I don't know, sometimes I think they just make up more acronyms so that they can tell the people that know what's going on from the people that don't know what's going on, or just to confuse everybody, hard to say. But in this case, the acronym is accurate. Okay, so CDI has to do with contexts and also with dependency injection. But of course, that doesn't help you at all, right? Because you don't know what contexts are necessarily. Maybe you do. You probably don't know what dependency injection is, although you might know that too. Okay, but this used to be called WebBeans. Now, for me, WebBeans was a nice name, very friendly. But then somebody said, "Oh well, that's too specific. Really, they're much more useful than just that." So a committee designed this name, and that's what we're stuck with. And on the other hand, the advantage is that once you know what contexts are and dependency injection is, then the name tells you what's going on. Okay. Anyway, you got to know the name. Basically, that's a short answer. Okay. So they can be stored in a context. So that's where the C is coming from. And they can be injected. That's the dependency injection. And other things that don't appear in the name is that they can deal with events. So that means that they can be used in architecture that is similar to graphical user interfaces, where if something happens, I create an event, and then people can sign up for the event, and they can be notified that the event has occurred, and then they can take whatever action they need to take. Okay, they pretty much replaced the older managed bean specification, and so I've pretty much deleted reference to the managed beans just to avoid confusing people. Okay, so the CDI beans is the thing to do. If you're using very old technology, you might see something else. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the older managed beans. Okay, CDI has been through a whole bunch of different specifications. They keep changing the numbers. The current one is 365, which I put in the course outline, gave you a link to, and it's not too unreadable, but if you have time, you can read the first chapter. It might prove enlightening, or you can try and go with just the slides. Your choice. Okay. So what's a stateful object? Well, a stateful object is an object that has state. Okay, what state? State and behavior is how I define objects way back. And so basically the state of an object is something that determines its properties at a particular point in time. And object-oriented programs will typically use objects that have state. Almost all of them have state. Okay, so the thing with a stateful object is at some point it starts existing, and then it's being used, and the state may change, and then it disappears at some other point, perhaps. Okay, so because two different objects may have different state, it's important that you are using the object that you intend to use and not a different object. Otherwise, you'll get the wrong state. So to help keep track of the object, contexts have been defined that can store objects. And they will store an object and get it back to you. Okay, so that's very useful. Okay, this is again just theory. We'll see. We saw an example last time. If I go, okay, let's see. Okay, here's clips, and let's see of the various. Okay, so login. So if I pull up a user bean from one of these examples, then the session scoped attribute tells me that this should be stored in a context called session scope without the D. So how does the lifecycle work? Well, I want to use the same bean between two pages. So in the first page, which is the index page, I reference it by its name in the expression language. And that looks for it in the session, doesn't find it because it hasn't been created yet. So it creates it and then returns a reference to it. And then the name is stored in the name field. The next reference, it's already in the session, so it returns a reference to the same object, and then it stores its password field. And then on the second page, okay, the thing with a session is that it's shared between pages. So when I want to read user.name, it looks in the session, sees, is there one? Yes, there is. It reads its name property with getName, and then returns it. And so it's critical that I'm using the same object in both places. Otherwise, I wouldn't get name from page 1 to page 2. Okay. So don't see any questions on that. But by the way, you can just speak your questions if you want, or put it in chat, and I will probably see it there too. Okay. So the thing with the example last week is that whether or not you understand how it works, it just does. But it's useful to understand the details, because that way, if you do it incorrectly, you'll get a mysterious error message, and the error message will be a little bit less mysterious if you know what's going on. Okay, now so we haven't seen dependency injection yet. You can basically, in your program, instead of creating an object, you can have the system create an object for you and just give you a reference to it. And that turns out to be very useful in building big systems. So it's something that they came up with way back when C++ was being invented. And it's gotten into a number of other languages, including Java. The difference here is that most dependency injection systems just use a string, and that's error prone. So Java uses the type, which is a lot more secure. The events I mentioned, I'm not going to talk a whole lot more about that. And the binding is very fancy, and I'm not going to do much more than mentioning it. So you're not going to have to learn that. If you want, it's in the standard. And similarly, writing, you can define your own contexts if you want to. There's a way of adding them in. But all that we really care about here are the first two major bullets: lifecycle and type-safe injection. And that will be enough for us. Okay. So as things get a little bit more complicated, you can say to yourself, well, thank goodness it's not even more complicated, because there's really complicated stuff that Bruce is not forcing us to have to learn unless we really want to, in which case we will get, I don't know, glory points in heaven or something like that. Not graded. Okay, so we can say a little bit more about a bean in this context, which is it's not only a Java object, but it's also one that's associated with a context. Okay, and the issue with that is that somebody has to manage the context to make sure they work properly. Okay, so when you browse to a website, and it's one that is backed up by an application, then at the very first request, a session is started. And then that session can hold whatever you want between page requests. So that's how, for instance, if you're buying something and you have a shopping cart, you go page to page, you don't use lose the shopping cart because it's being stored in a session. Okay. So somebody has to manage the session. So that means there's some server-side code, and the components of the server are often called containers. And again, more jargon. Okay, but the nice thing about it is that it works without you having to code it. So you could simulate all of these contexts with a lot of code, but probably you'd have bugs and it wouldn't work. Okay, so using something that is debugged and we can offload some of the complications. The only flip side is we have to learn how to use it. So there is a little bit of a cost, but it's net positive. Okay. Beans have to be bound to a lifecycle concept, and for a start, I can just go with a Java bean, 0 argument constructor plus getter and setter convention, and that will be a bean. CGI beans give you more capabilities. It gets a little bit more complicated. Okay.
Bruce, I have a question.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Okay. Can you go back to the previous slide?
Maybe. There.
Okay.
Yes, I can. Was that your question?
No. So it's
okay.
So
you have
it
a second
says
question.
yes. So it says beans are container managed objects,
Right.
So that makes sense to me based on your description of a shopping cart. It's in the same session. Presumably, if the container goes down, like you have a bigger problem. But like the example we did in the lab was like a username and password, which isn't that dangerous to store in a container? Because whenever a container goes down, you restart it. Don't you lose all of the state?
Okay. So if there's something you don't want to lose, then you're going to want to persist it.
How?
Well, generally writing to a database. Okay. So like, for instance, you might have heard of Amazon.
Yeah, AWS sort of thing.
Well, no, like buying books, say.
Oh yeah, okay.
Books, computers. I mean, nowadays, like I bought a coffee pot because my coffee pot broke. Okay. So all sorts of things. Toothpaste. Who knows? So with Amazon, it used to be that you could have a shopping cart, and when you went away and came back, you lost your shopping cart. Like in the early days of Amazon, that's the way it was. And then it occurred to them that they would get a lot more business if they didn't lose customers' shopping carts, because maybe somebody wants to go away and think about it. And if they have to find their items, they're never going to get back. They're just not going to buy it. So then they decided that they would store the shopping cart in a database. So that way, when the customer logs in, and then they have some hook to be able to pull the customer's shopping cart back out of the database, and then the next time you use a shopping cart, it gets basically recreated from what's been stored in the database.
So when you say
it gets more complicated, and we will get there in maybe a month or so.
So when you say container managed objects, you mean the container is responsible for giving the instruction to persist certain pieces of data?
Not this container.
Okay.
There is another container that deals with persistence.
Okay.
Okay. There's lots of containers. Like there's a container that deals with. It's called a servlet container, and that processes the servlets, and one of which processes JSF pages. Okay, so there's lots of different kinds of containers in a block diagram of this technology. But yeah, does that help, Scott?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Okay, good. So yeah, and so at the moment, now okay. As I said, there's different levels of persistence and how long something stays around. So each of these life cycles, each of the contexts has a different lifetime. So a session context will stay. It will start when the user interacts with the application, and it will stay around until it either times out, i.e. after inactivity for a certain amount of time, the session will go away, or often if the user logs out, then the session will be programmatically destroyed. Okay, but it's a long time, but not, because they do take up memory, so they don't stay around forever. After the user's been away for a while, then the session generally goes away. If you want to take another example, there is a request scope, which is only existing from the time the request comes in till the response is sent back. That's a relatively short lifetime. So anything you store in a request scope, it disappears fairly quickly. And there's also an application scope that stays around as long as the application is running. And on and on. So all these things are, you can choose, but we haven't gotten there yet. Okay, good. So thanks for that question. So the so beans, you have to create objects. So that means that they can't be abstract classes. Okay, so that's almost something everybody would assume, but they're specified. And the basic ones, the Java Bean ones, have zero argument constructor. It will turn out that you can generalize that by annotating constructor with inject. Okay, and I'll tell you how that works in a bit. And formally, it needs to be in an archive so you can find it. Okay. And now, if we have a web application, then that's put in a web archive, which might be zipped or unzipped, but that's in an archive already. So without doing anything, the user bean, which is inside of a web archive, was in an archive. And that WAR part will deal with just about everything that we're doing this year. If you're doing really big systems, you can package things up in jar files. Those are archives. Or EGB jar. There's an enterprise archive one, which is seldom used anymore. So there are different choices. And it can contain a marker file, but it doesn't have to. Okay. So of these, the main point is the second point. And if it has properties, it's not required to have any properties. The properties should satisfy the Java Bean specification. Okay. So the one last time, let me just flip over to that. User Bean. Okay. So why is this a bean? Well, it doesn't have any constructor. Therefore, the compiler gives you a zero argument constructor. Therefore, in fact, it does have a zero argument constructor. So it satisfies that. The properties that I want, which is name and password, follow the getter setter convention. So I tick that box off. And it's associated with a scope, which in this case is session, which I've told you, but we haven't seen on a slide exactly what that means. Now, I gave it a name, but that's optional. The name is if I want to use it directly from the web page. But there will be beans that I can't use directly from the web page. Maybe they're attached to other beans. So it's not the name that makes it a bean. Okay. Okay, so this was the next one, yes. So what do I do? Well, generally beans are nice ways of packaging, either storing data or storing logic. And I've got some choices. I can use them in expression language if I give them a name, which is what we've seen so far. But you can also call them from other Java code because they are just Java. Okay. We will see that depending on the kind of bean, I can access things that require like database transactions. I can access things that require login security. Okay, there's all of that is instrumented part of the specification. Okay, and if beans are using other beans, then the container will manage the dependencies of them. And what that does is it decouples my program and reduces the overall complexity of it. Okay, and again, that's mainly critical as things get bigger. With a small application, you can get around without this stuff, but it doesn't hurt. Now, the thing that requires getting used to initially is that the life cycle is not managed by you, it's managed by the container. So what does that mean? Okay, well, at this point, I guess you've had a year's worth of Java courses, most likely. And the only way you get an object is directly or indirectly by basically saying new, using the new operator, or maybe using class.newInstance. Okay. But one way or the other, you're creating the object. Sometimes you get it by calling a factory method that creates the object for you, but inside that code, it's again going through either new or class.newInstance. Okay, so then the trick is, how do you let go of that and deal with objects that you're not creating? And it's a little bit scary because if you're creating it, you know exactly when it was created, you know exactly how it started, what properties you gave it. Maybe you call a constructor that takes arguments. If you're not creating it, how do you get the right one? And the amazing thing is that you can let go of that and have the right one and basically use the facilities that the container provides. And in the end, it makes your life easier. In the short term, it's a different way of doing things, and it definitely is something that you have to get used to. Okay, so that's why I'm making a bit of a big deal. So now the stateful, well, that's just a Java thing. Contextual says that I'm not controlling the life cycle. I've at least not directly. Indirectly, I am, because I say what context is a part of, and then that implies what its life cycle is going to be. So in the back of my mind, I have to know what are these different contexts, how do they work, and use the right one in the right place. And it gets fairly natural in most situations. But of course, you got to get there. Okay. So the one of the main issues is getting the right instance when you're not creating the beans and you're not holding on. Oh, the other thing is you're not holding on to references to the beans. Well, I mean, what happens if, like, say I want to hold on to a reference so I know I've got the right bean? Fair enough. Okay, but then suppose I have a class, I have an object, the object goes away. Now, any references that the object had also go away. So if I lost my other object that I had the reference to, now I'm going to have to go out of my way to find it again. Okay, so there are issues either way. And with the contextual objects, you're not explicitly creating and destroying them. The container is doing it. So the scope tells you the life cycles of the beans that are in it. And when you're referring to a bean with a particular scope, then you know what bean you're getting. If you have a different scope, you're getting a different bean. Okay. So a little bit more about beans. Okay, so beans have types. I mentioned that earlier. To make sure that we get the right one, we can add qualifiers to them. That actually winds up with a little bit more Java that you might not have seen before. They have a scope, so that's another word that's commonly used for context. You can name them to use them in expression language, but that's optional because you don't have to use them in expression language. The first one that we saw last week was using expression language. I'll give you some in the lab that aren't. You can have bindings. Okay, so what's an interceptor? I'm not going to say a whole about how you do this, but it doesn't hurt to know what this is. So the idea is that you call a method, right? At this point, you've probably called at least hundreds of methods, maybe more. So what's your mental version of how that works? Okay, probably you've got some if your code works. So we generally expect that when you call a method, you maybe pop some return information and some parameters onto a stack, and then your code control jumps to start executing the method and then returns. And we never think much about, is there anything that goes on between our jumping to the method and when we get there? Okay, it's just atomic. Well, it turns out that things can happen. And so the idea is that when you call a method, before you get there, your call can be intercepted and run through a whole bunch of other software. So what does that do for you? Well, maybe you don't want everybody to be able to call a method unless they've logged in first. So before you get to the method, you get your call gets intercepted and gets run through code that checks if you've logged in. If you have logged in, then you go to the method. And as far as the method is concerned, it didn't see that. If you're not logged in, then maybe you get an exception and you never make it to the method. So being able to put interceptors in allows you to weave in a lot of extra capabilities without the developers having to code it. Okay, but it turns out that most of the useful ones are already there. So that would be an entire other class on how to put your own interceptors, which is outside the scope of what we're talking about. And then, of course, you need code that implements it. And there are cases where maybe you want a test version and a real version. And so I can have several versions of the same code. And to make it easy, there's some annotation that lets me say that a particular version of the implementation is an alternative, which I can turn on and off in a configuration code. Okay. And some of this I'm going to talk about in detail. Okay. So types, maybe we'll get through this before our break. Dependency injection I've mentioned. And so we have to know, how do you do this? And basically you inject something by type, which includes qualifiers. So that means I need to know a little bit about the type. And we've seen Java types. So int is a type, string is a type, object is a type. If I have an inheritance hierarchy, then I've got a lot of types that I can think of an object as being. So in general, we can have several types, and this is a simple version. So here we have a class. All of this is basically 1510 type stuff. Barely, although the extension was more talked about in the second Java course. Okay, so Bookshop is the immediate class. It's a subclass of business, and it turns out I'm not showing you business, but business is a subclass of object with nothing in between. So Bookshop, business, and object are types that this can have. That's 3 of them. And then I'm implementing an interface, so that gives me another type. Okay, so interfaces, classes, those both define Java types, nothing new there. And the possibilities for a class are all the possibilities given its definition. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense from Java. And from what we see now, those are all visible, given that you can see the class itself. So inspection would allow you to figure all this out. And so I can use each of these to inject an object of this type. Okay. Now, mind you, if you inject objects, you've probably got a lot of ambiguity because you've most likely got more than one thing that has objects as a type. So when you're injecting, you need to have exactly one possibility. Otherwise, there's an error. You got to fix it. Okay. So that's a little bit on type. So scope. I mentioned request scope, session scope, application scope. And so I'll continue this after our 10-minute break. So any questions? I'm going to try and give you breaks in the middle. Okay, so let's take 10-minute break. And then I'll stop sharing this and at least on paper go away. And so we will come by at back at 11:30, okay? And I will watch it. Anybody has questions? Okay, hello again. And so any questions that occurred to anybody on the break? And we will continue. Okay. So I was talking about scope. And so, as I said, each of the scopes has a certain lifetime, and there are lots of them. And if you read the spec, you'll find another 2 or 3 that are special cases, which I'm not going to mention pretty much. The 4 that you see there are pretty much the common ones, and for each of them you have to know when does it start, when does it finish, and in addition to those, there's also a case where you're not really using a scope as such, but instead each time when you create a bean object and it gets injected into another bean which does have a scope, then it inherits the same scope so that it doesn't just accidentally disappear when the parent bean is still around. And so that scope that you get if you don't specify a scope is called dependent scope. And there is a at dependent annotation for that as well. So that's sort of a special case. Each time you inject a bean, you will get a new object. And there are certain cases where that's really useful, other cases where it's really bad. So usually you want to think about the scope, you want to specify a particular one. Okay. So what are these? Okay, well, let's see. I have some slides on conversation. So let me just say briefly here on this slide. So I'd say request scope starts when a request is received from the browser by the server, and it stays around as long as that request is being processed and then disappears when the response is returned. Okay. And to really know what happens between the request and response, you have to know exactly what's happening on the back end. Okay, well, we need to know that. A session, as I said, it starts the first time you see somebody, you create a new session. Now, what does it mean to see somebody? Well, that really is not standardized, but by convention, it's almost always attached to the browser. So if I'm using 2 separate browsers, say, Windows, Edge, and Safari on the same computer for some reason, or Chrome and Firefox and Opera. I mean, there's lots of different browsers. So the browser holds the information that determines the session. So when I see the same application with a different browser, as far as the application is concerned, this is the first that's seen me, so it creates a new session. So the sessions are generally tied to the browsers. Application is independent of person, independent of browser. It's as long as the application is running. And then conversation. Okay, well, that's something that is started and stopped programmatically. So if I don't do anything with the conversation, but say that something is in conversation scope, then it would last basically the same as request. Okay? But I can extend it so it goes on between multiple requests. And but generally it will have a relatively short lifetime compared to session scope. One thing that you can think of is that, like with browsers, a conversation will be tied to a tab on the browser. Okay, so I can use conversations so that different activities on different tabs don't interfere with each other. And so then the choice between session and conversation is whether or not the different tabs should interfere with each other, or if they should be independent. So I've got a scope for each of those cases. The conversation scope one is a little bit harder to use just because you have to program it. So we'll have some labs on that. Okay, so that's a little bit more scope. Expression language name, we saw that, and we used the named annotation last term. Well, yeah, probably not that long ago, last week, I should say. So that's typo. Okay, now you can also use it with no value. And oh, by the way, I should say, okay, so with these funny quotation marks, that's just PowerPoint getting in, Microsoft deciding that it wants to prettify my text. They're just the normal double quotes, because it's a Java string. So I have to go through and, case by case. I probably should have turned off that conversion, but I didn't. So without a value, then you get the class name, but decapitalized. Okay, so in this case, the class was named UserBean, but I wanted to call it user, so I had to give it an explicit name. Okay. And by the way, if you don't have this annotation, then you've said that you don't want to deal with it from expression language. So if you do, it won't find it. So then you'll get an error message that people saw in different situations. So if I want to use CDI, then it's not that bad. Annotate things with named, give them a context, okay, and use the properties, and serializable. Okay, so hopefully you can cover that in the Java course somewhere. Basically, serializable says that you can take the object and convert it to something that you can store in a file or in a database or something like that. And with session scoped things, it turns out that those are around long enough that it has to be possible to move them from server to server without losing them. So the standard requires those to be serializable. But with the other scopes, it's your choice. So that's why I say it's probably a good idea to implement serializable, but it's only required per session. And if you're using a very, very old version, then you should put a Beans XML file. So that's optional too. We'll see next week some things that you can do with that. To actually have content in the Beans XML file. But for most of what we're doing in this course, you can get away without having a Beans XML file. It's good to know that it exists. Okay, so that means that of the easy version, I'm actually saying that the last one you shouldn't have to do. Should, well, in most cases, except for session, you can get away without doing that. So that winds up being the first couple of points, which is not that complex. Okay, so that's a start on the means. Now, what else is useful? Okay, well, the way long ago and far away, somebody told you about magic numbers, and that magic numbers were bad, and you should use either finals or constants to get rid of them. And somebody inflicted a lot of tedium in your life to do that. Okay. But it turns out that was just the start of the story, not the end of it. So it turns out that it's even worse than that, which is that even constants and finals are questionable. Okay, so the basic idea is that putting anything in your code that is really configuration type stuff should probably be stored somewhere else. And at the moment, I'm dealing with messages. Okay, so text messages. So say I want to have a header in a file, in a page, a web page. Okay, so no problem. I can just put it in my web page, and that's what we saw last time. So if we look, let's see, where was my index page? Okay, so the index page said, please enter your name and password. And you probably didn't think anything about it, but and then earlier I had welcome. Okay, so, and then I've also got, so name is text, password is text, and there's a hidden assumption here, which is that everybody in the world speaks English. Okay, now, surprise, that's not the case. There's at least 3 people in the world that don't speak English, I would imagine, maybe a lot more. Okay, but at least some. And so we then might consider, well, okay, what happens if we want our page to deal with those people? So, no problem. I just rewrite it in Punjabi. Then I discover that not everybody in the world speaks Punjabi. So then I write it in Chinese, and then that doesn't work. Well, Korean, maybe everybody should speak Korean. Okay, fair enough. But whatever choice I make, it's not going to be universal. So then the next stage is say, well, okay, the problem was putting those strings directly there in the first place. Okay, really it should be configuration information. Okay, so that's the idea of message bundles. Okay, so all the messages that are going to go into a string or that are going to be displayed that are language specific, for instance, you can pull out into a properties file. So a properties file is just name equals value. And here the name is the logical message, and the value is the language specific one. And then once I've done that, I can then have a message file for each language. And my web page will automatically pick up the right one, because when somebody comes in with a browser, the browser says, what's your preferred language? And if I support it, then with no change in code, I can come up with something. So if we look at, for example, in this week's example, which is number quiz, then and let's see, resources. Okay, so it should be, is this going to show me there? So it's always tricky where Eclipse is showing me. Down here, maybe. Okay. Oh, I didn't move it. Okay, so here I've got 2 property files. Okay, so the first one, now Eclipse will give me a nice tabular format. What it actually is just name equals message. And I happen to also have a German one, which has little German letters there. Raten Sie die nächste Zahl in der Folge. If you look in the source code, it actually turns out that non-ASCII things have to be in Unicode escapes. So that's a bit of a pain. So the more readable version is a bit nicer there. But now for each of the names, I have the corresponding German version. And not that many strings, so you can replace it with whatever language you want. Okay, so that's a message bundle. And now this doesn't work too well with big blocks of text. So it turns out that if you're dealing with massive descriptions, then people will often involve a database, and it gets a little bit more complicated. But this works for a lot of things. Okay. So I need to say where the message bundle is. So that's defined in the faces config, which we haven't seen before. And once I've done that and given a name, messages, for instance, I can then use it in expression language. Okay. So the next slide basically tells you some text that you have to do to say where it is, and I'm not requiring you to memorize that, but you will have to do it. And then to know the languages, you need to know the international prefixes for the languages. So, for instance, here I've got this PA is, I believe, Punjabi, FA is Farsi, ZH is one version of Chinese at least. I don't know, KR maybe for Korean. I mean, there's hundreds of these things. I happen to be using DE. Okay. So a tricky thing is that you're dealing with parts that maybe go in a different order in the different languages. Okay, so you can put in placeholders and then you can parameterize it. So in this example, this is going to be a number quiz, and so for the current score, I want to actually put in the current score, and so we see a tag that we haven't seen before, which is fparam, and that says evaluate the expression language, take the result, and put it in a particular parameter, starting counting at 0. Okay, so in this case, the 0th one. And you can do fancy things with currencies and all of that. Okay, it's quite powerful. All right, so that takes us to the application example, so depending on your browser, it'll come up in English or German. Whether or not I can in 30 seconds get whatever browser I've got to use the appropriate one is another story. But the basic idea is we're now trying to go beyond just a static 2-page example. So I'm going to take the answer, process it, and then change the score if it was right or wrong, and then go on to the next question. Okay, so each of these is intended to be a numeric answer, and it's worth looking at, although the way it navigates is just a hack, because we don't learn about navigation until next week. Okay, so it's, again, not completely good practice yet. Okay, so to handle something more dynamic, we need a bit more Java because there's more programming involved. So a quiz is a bunch of problems. So I've got a problem bean that has a list of numbers and the desired solution. And then the quiz will give me an array list of problems. And again, it's a hack because we don't know about databases yet, so that's initialized statically. And I've got a score, which is the person's current score. And then there's also a property to get the current problem, which is going to be displayed, and the answer that was typed in. Okay. And as a side effect, when somebody gives me an answer, I will then update the score and go to the next problem. Okay, so that's sort of a lot that's going on. Is there anything else I need to talk about there? Page, we'll see, and a little bit about scopes. Okay, so let's quickly have a look at this example. And now okay, now I should say, let me get rid of some of these things. Actually, let's get rid of all of that. Okay, now on D2L, you will find an old version of these problems that you can import into Eclipse. And if you update the JDK, update the server, you can get them to run no problem. The version that I'm going through is the one that's up on GitLab. Okay, under GitLab /BD link. And if you want, so let's go to GitLab and projects. Okay, actually, I need to move that out of the way. Who am I? Okay, so let me just go back here. And so under chapter 2. All right, so copy. And I lost my chat. There's my chat again. Okay, so here's the examples for this week. And you should find all the other examples in the same place. Okay, so you can download them, you can clone them if you want, you can make modifications to them, you can play them at your heart's content. And so interesting that went unsharing. Okay, so so I said that there's a little bit of Java involved. So the problem now so expand. So now notice that there's I don't have any annotations here at all. And so is this a CDI bean? Well, the answer is depends. If potentially it is, because it has a zero argument constructor, which you actually explicitly see there because I also have a argument constructor. And it has getters and setters, so it could be. We're not giving it a scope. So therefore, if it is a bean, it has dependent scope. And it turns out that whether or not it is a bean is dependent on the beans XML. If I have an empty beans XML, then this is a bean. But what does it do? Well, okay, so it allows me to basically create one with an array list of values, which is, well, that's what it's going to go into, and the solution. It's got getters and setters for those, not too exciting. The quiz is a bit more exciting. Okay, so this definitely is scoped, it's session scoped. Then, okay, I've got an array list of problem beans, and I'm creating problem beans. So it looks like since I'm using new, I'm not using it as a CDI bean. I'm just using it as regular Java class. Fair enough? Okay. So the is this a bean or is it a CDI bean? Well, okay, definitely I'm not using expression language because there's no named. But it still could be injected. Okay, but I'm not injecting it, and in fact, I haven't told you how to do that yet. So it's not a CDI bean. It's just a Java class. Okay, so maybe you didn't even think of that as a consideration, but it is a consideration, and I answered what sort of thing it is. And by the way, at least some of you will forget all this, and you will try and use a bean and create it with new, and then it won't work. Because creating an object with new, you are definitely saying you are not using it as a CDI bean. But you will have done that by accident, and then you'll get, again, the system will think, oh, what a clever person. And it will think that you did what you meant, and it just won't do what you thought it should do. So again, error. We get a lot of errors by doing things accidentally. So hopefully somewhere in your brain will be the things I just told you, and it will occur to you, and you will fix your problem shortly. Okay, so now what am I doing? So I created a bunch of problems, and I've got a setter, okay, which creates the problems as a whole. So that has a side effect of making the current index 0 and the score 0. Lots of side effects, not good style, but will improve with later weeks. Getter returns the score, and getCurrent returns the one that's at current index, and getAnswer returns an empty string so that it will display as a blank bit of text. setAnswer is called when the expression language sets the value, and so that converts the answer to an integer. And if it's the correct answer, increments the score. And either case, it goes to the next problem and wraps around if you go to the end. Okay, and if you have something that is not a number, then it just eats the exception. And again, how do you deal with errors? Well, we don't really know how to do that yet, but we will get to that. That's a validation question. Okay, so what's the page look like? Page. So that's in web app. One page. So the title is coming from messages, and the heading is coming from messages. And let's see if I will it show me? Okay, so Eclipse doesn't follow the messages at the moment, so that's not too enlightening. And so I print out the header for the current score, parameterized by the score itself, and telling you to guess the next one and what the problem is, the sequence, and then a text box for the answer, and then a command button that basically submits the value, and that's it. Okay, so what do I get with all of that? So if I do run as on server, then it goes through and deploys it. And so we see gets the next value. So let's say 8, which is not correct. And then it's still 0. And this is the Fibonacci 0. So here the next one is 8. And so my score goes up to 1. And this is square, so it should be 36. Okay, score goes to 0. And this is primes. So the next prime is probably 15. Okay, and no, that wasn't right. And then 2, 4, 6, 8. So powers of 2, it looks like. So we'll humor it. And then I wrap back around. Okay, and if I do something that's strange, okay, then okay. So notice a couple things. Let's see. So I didn't get any error messages down at the bottom, but it also took me to the same page. So generally, if you do something that okay, so what happened with this? Well, I wound up with an exception, and so generally, if you have an error, that will take you back to the same page. But what we'll have to get to is the point where we actually have error messages that show up at that point, just so we don't know how to do that yet. Okay. So so what we're seeing with all of this is that when we submit the form, which we did with the command button, it then will take the information that we type and process it. And at that point, we're into Java land. And in this case, so the idea is that when I do the submission, it then goes through and recreates the objects that correspond to the JSF tags and goes through, and with each of the values, it puts them in as strings. And if they're stored in a different context, so quizbean.answer, so quizbean set answer is stored as a string, so really there's no conversion required. And back to the index page. Then once all the values are stored, it then will execute potentially another method, but again, we'll see that next week. So with the mechanics that we got so far that I've talked about, all of the logic has been stuffed into the set answer. Okay, so that's a lot. I mean, that's a strange setter, actually. As I say, that's not good practice because a setter should just set something. Okay, it shouldn't do all this other stuff as well. But this is called faking it, and it's for the interest of basically getting going and doing something that with a message bundle that actually works. Now, if the message bundle didn't work, then you wouldn't get this text. And as I say, I've got, let's see, let me find. Okay, so Google, and so that was localhost ch2/number quiz, I believe, and 808009. Okay, and then the question is, how do I get, what am I using? Chrome. So Chrome settings, and then somewhere is language. And if I can't find it in 30 seconds, then I'm not going to try further. Site settings. Anybody know where the language is on Chrome? Oh, advanced. Haha. There we go. So languages. Okay, so language. So I've got English, and I'm going to take German, and I'm going to move it to the top. What a pain. And then go back, and we'll refresh this page. And now we have German. And okay, so 0 points. And so on. Okay, so it does work with multiple languages. Oops. And if I go back, which now that I know how to do it, will not take that long. And raise English to the top. And see now, because this is still sitting on the browser, like to get the effect of, I need to make another request. So I refresh it. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, now, okay, now notice that I had to remember when I'm just typing, I had to remember what I called the name of the application. Okay, so big deal, but that is something, and that's why if I went back to the one that I've installed, okay, this is me, good. So as a developer, I have this on the cloud. Okay, so this is not running on localhost. So for this one, it's got a nice little open URL, and that's much easier for me to get to. Although because I haven't tried to give it a nice URL, that's actually a separate thing I haven't told you how to do yet. But again, it's easy to run something from the cloud. Okay, so how do I progress? Well, see, by the time I put something in the cloud, it should be reasonably working. So I probably want to debug it on my laptop first, or at least get it closed. So that means that there is a whole workflow issue. So that's why I've got Eclipse, I've got Wildfly on my laptop, and I can run things on the laptop with running in localhost. And once I've done that, I can then push it to repository, such as GitLab. Oh, by the way, this is sitting in the repository. Well, there's another little icon here which says edit source code. So if I click on that, then it'll take me back to the repository where the source code is. And so if something doesn't work, I can click on that and put in a little, a ticket against my repository and maybe fix it if I ever get around to it. Good luck with that. Okay. So with all these toys, you need a process that works to put them all together, which will take us a while before we get to that. But as I say, I probably want to start out on my local environment, and then push things to a repository, which maybe I want to have private or public. That's another issue. Anything that's in a public repository is copyable. That's the point, which means things like assignments for sure, and maybe also lab assignments, you better have in a private repository, not a public one. Because if somebody copies your assignment, you still get 0. So you got to be careful with repositories. And it turns out that you can do an intermediate version, which is run in the clouds sort of locally. Okay. And it even gets fancier than that. Okay. But I think, so that's this example. We saw it in German and in English. And this is also a Mavenized version. So if you want to get some examples of things that actually work with Maven, well, you've got that repository that I gave you. Those are public, the chapter 1, etc. Those are public things. So you can just, copy that as a zip file or a clone or whatever, and you can see some examples of working Maven projects. Okay, anyway, so back to slides. Okay, so a little bit more on scope. So at this point, I've talked about most of this, but there's a few other things. So one of the things that you may not have covered in your web course, which probably you should have, but then if you covered everything that I should have, it would be like a 25-week course, is forward versus redirect. So this is something that's going on all the time with your browser, but you're probably not aware of it. So sometimes you send a request to a particular page in the server, and the server decides that based on something that you want to go to a different place. And so it can change the page inside the server. And that's called forwarding. The other possibility of getting from one page to another page is that the server will tell you, okay, you gave me a request, but that's not where it is. Try this URL. And so the server sends back a not here response, and then the browser automatically will go to the new place. So that's called a redirect. Okay, and that's relevant because the way JSF works is when you do a post, you go back to the original page, and it goes through and processes the page, and at the end, it winds up going to the resulting page, which gives you the response. And by default, that will be internal to the server, and it will use a forward. But you can use redirect instead. Now, why is that relevant here? But by the way, that's what has been happening since last week's example. I didn't comment on it. But what you will see is, if you look carefully, the URL in your browser was the original request, not the page that's coming back if it's using forwarding. That is often okay, sometimes confusing. You can always use redirect to get the page that you see as the page that's appearing in the URL. And there are issues around which you should use, which I'm not going to talk about right now. We'll talk about that further, okay? But with request scope, I said that the scope lasts from the original request coming in to the server till the response goes back. So it could visit several pages in that. So in the example last week, where I have a login page, goes to the next page, that was using forwarding. So even though I had session scope, I could have used request scope there, it still would have worked. Okay, so there's another variable. To know what request scope means, you have to know, are you using forwarding or redirection to get to the next page? Okay, so one more thing to worry about. Now, the one more thing to worry about on session scope is that because a session is used for sort of an entire browser session, hard to think up another word for it, it's a good word, then that means that I could have multiple tabs hitting the same session. So therefore, I could have more than one process at a time hitting the same session. Therefore, the beans could have multiple processes running through them. Therefore, they have to be thread safe. Now, in practice, it's very hard for a human being to flip from page to page and do something else and do it all fast enough so that there actually would be a conflict. So practically speaking, a session scope doesn't have to be absolutely thread safe. That's why I said should. But if it's not, then you're leaving yourself a hazard for somebody that wants to hack you. So if you're going for an interview, that's something you got to know about, because there are security issues. So therefore, you would brush up on this and say, if you're likely to be asked about sessions, that anything that you're using would have to be thread safe. Okay, professionally, it's required for your hobby things that you don't care if it gets hacked or taken down, less of a big deal. Okay, and something that's, with application scope, again, every user that's coming in has the same application scope. So you might, if you're lucky, have a lot of parallel users, so you definitely have to be thread safe there. Okay, now, of course, the problem is that you don't know what that means or how to get it. Unless you're lucky, your Java course, second Java course, didn't tell you how to do thread safe. Sometimes they do that if they have time on their hands, but usually not. It will turn out that one of the tasks moving forward is ways of making things thread safe without having to worry about it, where just the framework does it for you. And that's quite handy because it's tricky to make things thread safe. It's very error prone. So this is what's called a cross-cutting concern. In addition to the thing that you're trying to accomplish, you also have to worry about a bunch of other things. In parallel, it's hard to worry about more than one thing. So we're happy to have frameworks that take the load off of us. Okay. So, but formally, these are things that you have to know. Okay. Conversation scope. As I said, those are programmatic. And if I want to have a conversation scope that is extended to go beyond the request, then I have to have code that calls a begin method on the conversation. And then an end method when I finish the conversation. And when you call end, it removes it from conversation scope, and it goes back to being request scope, which means it survives until the end of that request. So when you say end, it doesn't destroy it. It just moves it back to request scope, logically. Okay, so we'll have labs on this. This is a bit tricky to use. Okay. Now, injection. Say I have multiple beans and I want to use them, and then my question is, how do I do that? Well, I've got choices. And one thing is if you can create the bean, that's okay, but the tricky thing is if I want to use the same bean, how do I keep track of it and not lose it? And using the server, basically offloading from your logic to the server's logic to keep track of it, that's one less thing you have to worry about. And so that was called a long time ago inversion of control. In other words, you're not doing it, the server's doing it, or also dependency injection. And that winds up being a convenient thing as I'm building bigger and bigger systems. But it is a different way of thinking about the world. So you sort of have to get used to it. Okay. And more on that later. I don't remember this coming week's lab or the one after that, but we will get some examples of that and then it will make more sense. Okay. The other thing that you can occasionally do is you can have events that where your code is aware when something is happening to it. So when your bean is created, you're not creating it. So what happens if there's special code you got to run outside of the constructor? Okay, well, you put in a method and you annotate the method with a post-construct method annotation. And so when the server creates a bean, it will run a constructor. And after that, the bean has been constructed as far as Java is concerned, it'll call a post-construct annotated method to do whatever for initialization. Like maybe you need to open a file or something. And if your bean is going to be destroyed, then it will give you a warning if you have a pre-destroy annotated method. Okay. And again, most cases you don't have to have either of those, but they're there for solving certain problems that you might run into. Okay. There's a bunch of ways of configuring beans, and you can do that in XML files. 95% of the time you can do it with annotations, and so I talk about the annotations and I leave these other things as just be aware it exists. I'll maybe have one example, but it's not enough that you have to particularly learn. Okay. There is some syntax which I gave you an image on that, but that's again various possibilities. That's for completeness. Don't sweat it. There's enough stuff that you have to sweat. Okay? Now with expression language, we've seen the easy version already, user.password. But there's mechanisms for dealing with arrays, array lists, all of those things along the path. So the basic idea is that you follow properties by using a dotted notation. But alternatively, you can use what looks sort of like an array type location with a string. Okay, so these two user.password or user brackets quote password are equivalent. The one with a string works in cases where your property was, not a simple name that will work in Java code. Okay, that bracketed notation will also work when I want to pull something out of a map given a name, or to index into a list or an array. Okay? And the idea is that once you identify the initial part of it, which requires something that was named, then it's more or less Java thereon. Okay. So 90% of stuff we're going to be doing, maybe 95, 98%, just a user.property, and maybe further dot properties and so on. That will be all we'll need. Normally in expression language, we're using properties. We're not using method names. Okay, so the method is inferred from the property name. But there are cases where you have to have a parameter, and you can call methods in expression language, but it's questionable style unless you really need to. Okay, and oops. So a few more examples on that. Now, where does it find the bean? Okay, so I just said user, it's got to find it somewhere. Well, it turns out there's lots of places that it could look. So there's a variety of maps that are associated with the header values and the request. There are parameters as well. There's cookies. There's whole piles of things, and then there's all these scopes. And so if you say like header, then you're specifying something that's in the list of HTML headers. If you don't say one of these names, then it will look in the CDI scopes. Okay, first it'll look in request scope, then it'll look in session scope, and the first place it finds the name or something with the appropriate type, then that's what it'll go with. So it's a coding error to have the same name in multiple scopes. Okay, because then you're really taking your chances. If it doesn't find it, because it doesn't look yet, then it will create one and stick it in the appropriate scope. Okay, so there are, again, you usually you don't have to think very much about this, it just works. Okay. Method expressions, I talked about that. That's just for reading, and that's it for today. So any questions? I guess I'm 3 minutes over, sorry about that. And let's see, what have I got on my, pull up the chat again. Okay, and so don't see any questions there either. Okay, so be sure that you get the lab sorted. Again, there's kickstarting lab 1, lots of moving parts, and I think I found about 8 people that had made it through to the or maybe they had just done it, but one way or the other they had done the WordPress example. So that's great. I hope to see everybody there before we get around to next Monday. Okay, so thank you. Now there was so I've got no other questions. Then I will let you go and stop sharing.
Actually, just one question, Bruce.
Okay, just one question. So ask.
Sorry, no, it was I emailed you regarding office hours, and you said you had a time slot available after class, and
yeah,
later on in the afternoon. Does after class work still?
Well, we can just do it, after this class sort of winds down.
Great.
I don't know. did you have things that you want to talk one-on-one, or things that everybody could watch that they care? Which is
It
probably
was
the
just
most.
regarding the lab. Couldn't quite get one of the, well, I guess if one step kind of stops you from working, then it's that step. But yeah, I mean, everyone's free to join if they want. It's just regarding the lab.
Okay. Yeah. What I find is that like there are a lot of common issues that many people fall into.
Right.
So sometimes it's boring watching somebody else's problems being sorted. Sometimes it's valuable, and I never know in advance which it's going to be. So, no, so I can with these. Okay, so in theory, yes. Okay, breakout rooms. Yeah, so I can do a breakout room with just you, or I can just leave it, continue on this for everybody that wants to stay around. That's why I ask. It's possible to deal with things in privacy as well as ongoing. I will hopefully very quickly get fixed office hours, but I'm waiting, as I mentioned earlier, to see with one course which students I've got.
Right.
And sort out their schedule. So there's 5 other hours, so I can't really establish my office hours until that happens.
For sure. I mean, we can just continue your
Yeah. Okay.
Nothing private, like it's just literally just lab work.
Right. So any other questions? Because the next period when I'm actually doing something is in 4 minutes. So if anybody wants to ask any other questions, I can. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Wilson to, let's see. Okay, so do we need to upload lab 1 to GitLab? No, you do not. I specifically was not doing that. And that may be the case in lab 2. Wait for it. But I figured I'd given you enough for lab 1. So if you thought that, lab 1 was too trivial, I did it in 5 minutes, let me know, I can always add more. But I didn't have the feeling that was the case. Okay, so any others? So it's quiz next lab. Okay, so possibly. So I think in I'm just trying to think of what would have a quiz on. So I've got to set up quizzes differently than in previous years, and so the answer is I don't know yet. So you should be prepared, because you won't always know. Like the quizzes can be a surprise. Okay. Good question. I'd like to have the answer myself too, but I haven't decided yet. Okay, any other questions in the chat or verbally? Okay. Okay, so then back over to, and I'll just, again, if you have any issues, you can always email me. And what I'm doing until I get my office hours established is just doing ad hoc meetings with people that need to on a time available basis. Okay, so what's going on, Wilson?
Do you want me to just share screen? I think that's probably the easiest, right?
Sure. Can you just a second? Let me just make sure, because I have to. Okay, allow participants to do that. So yes, go ahead.
Alrighty.
And thank you, everybody.